Forget noble knights in shining armor, paladins and chosen ones. In sword and sorcery, your hero is most likely a roguish wanderer, a thief with a quick wit, or a mercenary who fights for the coin, survival, or revenge. The stakes are not about saving kingdoms or fulfilling grand prophecies anymore. They are about one man's life, freedom or pride. They're about surviving another day, chasing a treasure, or exacting personal revenge. Welcome to Sword and Sorcery, the pulpy, gritty cousin of high fantasy. It's a genre that strips away epic battles and grand destinies and instead plunges us into taverns, brimming with intrigue, cursed ruins, and one-on-one duels in the dead of night.
In today's video, we are diving into the visceral, thrilling subgenre of sword and sorcery. We will explore what makes this subgenre so compelling, how it focuses on the personal rather than the grandiose, and why it still holds a place in the minds of fantasy fans. It's a genre where the heroes are flawed, the villains are dangerous, and the line between the two is razor thin. If epic fantasy is the symphony, sword and sorcery is the rock anthem. Welcome to the rougher side of fantasy. Let's get to it.
Sword and Sorcery is fantasy stripped down to its core, raw, immediate, and unapologetically thrilling. Forget about saving the world or fulfilling ancient prophecies. This genre hones in on survival, personal ambition, and personal stakes. It's the story of a lone warrior fighting for their freedom, a cunning thief chasing one last score, or a sellsword facing impossible odds. Not for glory, but because they need the coin to eat. It's about the here and now, where decisions are made on instinct. Survival is never guaranteed, and even the smallest victory feels hard-earned. The tone, gritty and grounded, with flashes of dark magic or ancient forces lurking at the edges. The world is rarely kind, and the heroes are rarely flawless. Let's talk about Conan the Barbarian, the poster child of sword and sorcery. Conan is a thief, a warrior, and sometimes even a pirate, driven by survival, treasure, and the occasional grudge. His stories are about him sneaking into a cursed temple to steal a jewel, fighting off an ancient sorcerer, or surviving a brutal betrayal. What makes Conan so compelling is how human he is. He's cunning, resourceful, and fearless, but also very flawed. He doesn't fight for ideals or glory, he fights for what he can hold in his hands: gold, revenge, or simply the chance to live another day. That raw, unapologetic focus on the personal is what makes Conan so enduring in the genre.
Sword and sorcery is all raw, personal moments and what is right in front of the characters. The stakes may not seem grand in a traditional sense, but they are immediate. These are characters who fight for survival, freedom, or revenge. And that's what differentiates the genre. It lives in the moment, to the point that a lot of stories are like procedurals, in which nothing changes in the status quo every week, and it's just about the monster of the day that's being defeated by the hero. Now that we have a better idea of what sword and sorcery is, let's explore its origins.
Sword and Sorcery traces its roots back to the pulpy, gritty storytelling of the 1930s and 1940s, when magazines like Weird Tales brought thrilling, fast-paced adventures to the readers. These were tightly woven, self-contained tales that hooked you from the first sentence and didn't let up. Writers like Robert E. Howard, Fritz Leiber, and Michael Moorcock became the defining voices of the genre, creating worlds where danger was around every corner and heroes carved their paths through sheer will, wit, or the swing of a blade.
The stories leaned heavily into the fantastical and the primal, embracing ancient ruins, cursed artifacts, and magic that was as dangerous as it was alluring. Sword and Sorcery is escapist fun, but also explores themes of power, survival, and human ambition in a much more personal way than epic fantasy. It was pulp at its finest, bold, unapologetic, and endlessly entertaining.
We already discussed a bit about Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian, but Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser is also worth mentioning. The story is a cornerstone of sword and sorcery, and for good reason. These two unlikely companions, a towering northern barbarian and a sly, quick-witted thief, bring a sense of camaraderie and fun character dynamics to the genre. Together, they navigate the corrupt city of Lankhmar, facing bizarre foes and deadly sorcerers, all while cracking jokes and forming a bond that feels very human. Leiber's stories bring a sharp wit and a touch of melancholy to the genre.
I usually like to look at the cultural context at the time the subgenre became popular to understand what influenced the popularity. Sword and sorcery emerged during a period of significant cultural and social change, particularly in the early 20th century, when pulp magazines blew up. We had the Great Depression, the aftermath of the Great War, and the approach of World War II created a world rife with uncertainty, economic hardship, and disillusionment. People were looking for escapism, and sword and sorcery provided a gritty, action-packed outlet that contrasted sharply with the more optimistic and idealized narratives of traditional epic fantasy. The lone wolf, morally ambiguous type of characters of sword and sorcery spoke with audiences who felt disillusioned by institutions and great ideals. These stories were focused on personal survival, ambition, and individual agency in a chaotic and cruel setting, which reflected the fears and struggles at the time. The genre showcased the desire for stories that acknowledged the harshness of the reality while offering cathartic escapism, and it also showed people were losing faith on the morality of the institutions.
Unlike epic fantasy, sword and sorcery doesn't need sprawling continents or multi-layered maps to create a compelling world. Instead, it thrives on localized settings, a single city teeming with intrigue, a cursed forest full of predators, or an ancient temple hiding deadly secrets. These worlds may be smaller in scale, but they're alive with detail. The focus isn't on the breadth of the world, but the depth of the places the characters explore. You don't need to memorize an encyclopedia of lore to follow along. The story gives you just enough to feel the weight of the history and the danger of the moment.
Take a bustling city as an example. It is a backdrop and a labyrinth of shadowy alleys, bustling markets, and taverns filled with whispered deals and veiled threats. A single ruin in sword and sorcery can feel like an entire universe because of the way the atmosphere draws you in. And the immediacy of the settings create an intimacy with the narrative. You don't need an entire world being designed because the small locations are already detailed enough. You're not exploring distant lands with a bird's eye view. You're in the thick of it, feeling the grit of the cobblestones or the chill of the cursed air. So the locations become personal and essential to the plot.
Let's talk about Nif the Lean. The titular thief embarks on adventures that bring him to eerie, hyper-focused settings brimming with atmosphere. One such place is the underworld-like realm of Gulb, where every element of the setting oozes danger and decay. Gulb is an oppressive, hellish space filled with grotesque creatures and bizarre, otherworldly architecture. The compact setting heightens the sense of peril and mystery.
The intimate scale here enhances the tension and immediacy of Nif's adventures. It really embodies sword and sorcery's knack for creating worlds that are not very wide but deep, small but immersive. Now that we know the scale of sword and sorcery's world building, let's explore how magic is handled in the genre.
Magic in sword and sorcery is a wild, unpredictable force that operates more like a dangerous storm than a tool to master. It doesn't come with rulebooks or clear boundaries. It's chaotic, rare, and often terrifying. Unlike the structured, almost scientific magic systems we see in epic or hard fantasy, magic in this genre feels ancient and unknowable. It's not something the heroes typically wield themselves, but something they encounter, fight against, or are reluctantly forced to use. Sorcery is an ominous presence, its power always coming at a cost, and its users are usually individuals with their own twisted agendas.
Think of the sorcerers in these stories. They're usually priests of forgotten worlds, necromancers communing with the dead, or shadowy figures drawing power from cursed artifacts or from shady sources. These are not your wise mentors or kindly wizards. They're manipulators. They're often detached from human morality, seeing people as pawns or sacrifices in their arcane experiments. Magic in sword and sorcery is more about atmosphere and danger than flashy fireballs. It might manifest as a forbidden ritual, whispered in the dark, a demonic presence lurking in the shadows, or a cursed object that corrupts anyone who touches it. Its rarity makes it even more unsettling when it does appear. What makes this approach to magic as compelling is how it reinforces the journalist's themes. Magic isn't there to solve problems or make life easier. It's there to complicate things, to tempt, to corrupt, and to challenge. A mercenary might face a dark sorcerer raising the dead, or a thief might steal a cursed gem only to find themselves hunted by the ancient entity. Magic in Sword and Sorcery, it's about survival, and the heroes are often pitted against forces far beyond their comprehensions.
In Elric of Melnibone, Michael Moorcock gives us one of the most haunting depictions of magic in Sword and Sorcery through Elric's cursed blade, Stormbringer. This sword is a force of dark magic that grants Elric incredible power, but at a cost so steep. Stormbringer feeds on the souls of its victim, growing stronger with every life it takes. Friends, allies, even those Elric loves, aren't safe from its hunger.
There's a tragic irony in how Eric relies on the sword while despising what it makes him do. This duality is what Sword and Sorcery does so well. Magic in Sword and Sorcery isn't something to admire or strive for. It's constant temptation and a curse, and it works really well as a way to test the characters and to provide challenges to their character arcs. It's about moral struggle, dangerous consequences, and the way it shapes the characters who dare to yield it.
Sword and Sorcery heroes stand in stark contrast to the noble knights and destined chosen ones of epic fantasy. They're not burdened with grand prophecies or the fate of the world resting on their shoulders. Instead, these characters are rogues, mercenaries, and outcasts, people trying to carve out a life in harsh, unforgiving worlds. They fight not for honor or glory, but for survival, revenge, or the thrill of the fight. Maybe they're hunting for treasure to buy their next meal, avenging a betrayal, or just trying to stay one step ahead of the next deadly threat.
What makes these characters so compelling is their flawed humanity. They're not paragons of virtue. They're messy, complicated, and sometimes selfish. But their resourcefulness and grit are what draw us in. When faced with overwhelming odds, they don't call on divine intervention or destiny. They rely on their wits, their skills, and sheer determination. Sword and Sorcery heroes are relatable because they're imperfect, and their stories resonate because they feel immediate, raw, and personal.
Conan is the archetype, a barbarian who rises through sheer strength and cunning, but isn't, however, a one-dimensional brute. He's a thief, a warrior, and eventually a king. His motivations are deeply personal. These characters thrive in the moral gray zone, navigating worlds that are just as treacherous as they are. Geralt of Rivia is a modern archetype of Sword and Sorcery, a brooding, morally ambiguous monster slayer for hire. As a witcher, Geralt is an outcast, mutated and trained to fight creatures that most people fear to even name. His world is harsh, and his motivations are grounded in survival, personal codes of honor, and sometimes coin. But what sets Geralt apart is his complexity. He may come across as stoic, but he's capable of great compassion and introspection. Themes like the corruption of power and the cost of freedom are at the heart of Sword and Sorcery stories. These tales often follow characters who desire independence, wealth, or revenge, only to discover that the price of these pursuits is higher than they imagined. A lone warrior might escape servitude, but find that freedom means constantly fighting off enemies. A thief could strike it rich, but lose their humanity in the process, becoming consumed by paranoia and greed. These stories thrive in the gray areas, where the line between hero and villain blurs, and survival often demands difficult, morally questionable decisions.
The moral complexity also provides a lens to explore universal themes like ambition, sacrifice, and trust. Power in these settings is often a curse. It's a heavy burden that tests the limits of the character's resolve. The cost of achieving one's goals often leaves scars. And this is a minefield for compelling storytelling. Asking for a cost for victory is such a compelling way to make your character arcs more interesting. Sword and Sorcery shows us that every victory comes at a price, and even survival can be bittersweet.
Sword and Sorcery strips fantasy down to its raw, visceral essence. Gritty characters, immediate stakes, and a world that's as dangerous as it is enthralling. It's a genre about flawed heroes fighting for survival, treasure, or revenge. Rather than lofty ideals or the fate of the world, Sword and Sorcery thrives on personal stakes and thrilling high-stakes adventure. It's a genre where every decision has a cost, every victory comes with scars, and every step forward feels earned.
So, what do you particularly like about Sword and Sorcery? Because of the nature of TV series today, people prefer serialized stories. So the episodic nature of Sword and Sorcery may be a bit difficult to adapt in a way to please modern audiences. This is the reason why Witcher needed to change some structural things about the source material. Also, let me know what subgenre would you like to see tackled next here in the channel. Thanks for watching, and until next time. Come join our Tavern discussion of fantasy storytelling and world building here at Loregeist. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. Thanks for watching, and may your tales be ever epic.